Clare Norman, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
You're a long-standing friend of the school, I could say. I've heard Nick talk about you many times. You've been invited to share your wisdom, your knowledge. You've been around. I've seen your name a lot, especially the last couple of years, and especially since you've wrote your last book, The Transformational Coach. Before you wrote a book on mentor coaching, a really practical guide, really helpful writing. So anybody who you're not a name to, I really encourage you guys go out there and dig into a little bit of Claire's writing because it's really practical, it's really clear. So Transformational Coach, you write a lot about unlearning what coaches have learned in school from parents, in the coaching schools. So there's so many little trends, little patterns, little habits that snuck into people's coaching practice. And as a mentor coach, I think the last bit I've heard was from 2021, you've observed over 700 hours of coaching from over 200 different coaches. So yeah. You're inside the practice.
I am right inside it.
Yeah. Before we dive into that, I wonder if there's other things that people need to know about you. I mean, you're PCC, ICF, you've got over 25 years of experience in organizations. You've done a lot of leadership coaching, and you've worked obviously with a ton of coaches. What else do people need to know about Clare Norman to understand more where you're speaking from?
So, the big deal for me is that I recently applied for my MCC. So I'm just on tenterhooks waiting to see whether that comes through. I hope it does. But if it doesn't, it's been a wonderful journey of learning and growing and really got me out of my comfort zone. So I suppose the thing to note about that is it also means that I've gone through mentor coaching myself. So that is one of the things I'm known for, is mentor coaching others. But going through it myself, I also recognize how tough it can be on a coach who maybe thinks they're already good. I thought I was already good at the beginning, and then realized, oh, I've got quite a lot to unlearn here. Coming back to the unlearning. So that's one thing to know about me. Yes, I was in the corporate world for, I don't know, I've lost count really. And much of that time was leadership development, and coaching was on the side. So that's where I cut my teeth with coaching, was inside organizations, and then went out on my own nearly 8 years ago. So have been building my practice and learning and growing around business development as well, because you know, one thing to have been a coach for 20 plus years, it's quite another to build a business when you never had to do that before. So I feel for coaches who are at the beginning of their business development journey, because I know how I felt way back then.
Yeah, that's how you started out in business, and then you transferred into coaching from that?
So I was an internal coach inside a big organization, massive organization. And then although it wasn't my day job, so it was still on the side of my job, but I was racking up as many hours as I could, because, you know, for those people who are internal coaches, it's much easier to rack up hours of coaching when you're internal than it is when you're external, much easier. And of course you get to count them as paid. So I encourage people to stay where they are if they're internal coaches, because you tend to be able to do more of it.
Can I jump in there? Because I have a lot of coaches asking me, how can I build the kind of business where I don't have to do the marketing and the business side of things? And internal coaching, your face, people are listening to this, please come watch this. Like internal coaching is a fantastic way to get those hours. I mean, there's things that make it more complex, other things that are really beneficial. But like, what did you do to become an internal coach? Did that just happen? Or how can people make that happen if they are in an organization profession, or they would like to be an internal coach?
So for me, I was heading up our Leaders of All Levels strategy, and I noticed how, people would have these aha moments on our courses, but then they wouldn't actually make the switch when they went back to work, because the workplace just wasn't supportive of the changes that they were trying to make, or it was just too hard, or just not enough time, or whatever it was. There were always excuses. And so I was looking for ways to transfer that aha moment out of the classroom and really make the change happen in the workplace. And so I did some research, and this is when I stumbled onto coaching. So this was over 20 years ago. And so to start with, I was building it onto the back end of training. So they'd go on the training and then they'd have coaching. But then over time, I started to do it as a standalone as well. So for me, I just made it happen. Right. Even though it wasn't part of my job description, I was passionate about it. I loved it. And I was going to do it whatever happened. And so I did it off the side of my desk. I mean, it felt to me like it was absolutely integral to leadership development, which I was responsible for. So it made sense that I would do that. Over time, I was, definitely championing the broadening out of this. So it wasn't just me. It became, we had a community of practice, which I was one of the leaders for, because there were lots of pockets of people who were finding coaching and getting trained as coaches and wanted to be able to offer this, again, off the side of their job. I think most of us would have liked to have done it as our actual day job, but the opportunity wasn't there at the time. It was after I left, but not while I was there. So yeah, for me, it was about creating those opportunities for myself, seeing the opportunities. I did also, so that's, at that time, I also started writing a blog. That's where my writing journey really began. And at one point, I had more followers on my blog than the CEO had visiting his webpage. The equivalent of an internal LinkedIn page, for example. So I was really proud of that. Oh, look, I've got more followers than the CEO. But what that meant was I could start to build a crescendo for coaching. I could get managers as coaches interested in this skill of coaching. It meant that I was making a name for myself as I suppose the go-to person who knew stuff about coaching and was passionate about it. And so, was able to gather some momentum because of building this community of passionate people. And that was, as I said, it was all off the side of my desk. It wasn't my day job. I didn't get rewarded for it particularly. But the reward for me was in the coaching itself. I loved it. So
it just goes to show how when we're passionate about something and your passion clearly shines through, if we allow it to let it out, in conversations, in mentioning and talking about it and writing about it, people start knowing us as somebody who's passionate about these things. And then you may become that go-to person. I'm totally going to use this as a segue into what you've been writing about, right? You talk about mindset. You talk about the stories we create as we grow up and as we train to be coaches and as we walk through life. So could you tell us a bit more about why it's so important to explore how we've come to be the person that we are to help us be better coaches?
So you just mentioned one just a few seconds ago about a shift. You talked about coaching as a service, and then you said, oh no, a partnership. And So there's a real shift in mindset from, we learn this service mentality in the workplace. We learn to jump when our manager says jump. We learn to give, that is the expectation of us, to give good customer service.
All for the client.
The client is always right, all that stuff. And it can actually get in our way of doing a really great job as a coach, because we can treat them like a consumer. So they are buying our service, and yes, they are buying our service, or their organization is buying our service. So there is payment involved. However, once the payment bit is dealt with, we really need to move into this partnership space so that we are operating as equals. We are not spoon feeding them as they're not buying a consumable from us. They are buying time to think. And actually, that is quite hard for them to think. It's a difficult thing to think. So some people come to coaching thinking it's the easy option, thinking, oh, pixie dust, let me get a bit of that, please, magic. It's not. It's actually hard work for the thinker. So if they come into this as a consumer, expecting to be spoon-fed as a consumer would be, then this relationship is just not going to work. They're going to try and hook us into mentoring. Mm-hmm. Whereas if we can shift our own mindset into this partnership, this thinking partnership, then that's also going to enable them to shift into that as well, so that they recognize this as something different. It's not the same kind of conversation as they've ever had in the past, unless they've had coaching in the past.
Yeah, let me jump in there, because there's a couple of things you mentioned that I kind of want to underline and take a bit further. Because I just came back from an event in Malta, and the organizational culture there particularly is one of the coach as a service provider. And most of the coaches there saw themselves as service providers. And that was a dynamic that was not ideal for good coaching to take place. I mean, there's clearly value in it when somebody's helping you think as a service provider, but somebody's helping you think in a partnership is really quite something else. And I'm sure you're familiar with the prosperous coach and the Chandlerian school of coaching, as I call it. And they emphasize serving so much, right? Serve your clients. I think it's a somewhat different positioning towards what serving means.
Yeah.
So I think they can probably go hand in hand, but I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, I'm with you on that.
They're really pushing the serving angle, right?
Yeah, and because that's what we've always known. That's what we've grown up with in business. We have been taught to serve. And maybe we learn that in other places as well in our lives, in other relationships. We are taught to respect our elders, for example. So that, to me, that can absolutely get in the way of me offering. So there's a difference in the value that we add as a service provider versus a partner. The value that we add as a service provider might be in, doing some research for them afterwards and sending them some links on some stuff, or sending them book recommendations, or giving them hints and tips on what to do differently based on what other people have done in the past. But what that is missing is the value of enabling them to think for themselves. And surely that is what is going to help people to self-actualize, is enabling them to think for themselves, to grow in their own shoes, to build their own confidence that, yes, I've got this. I don't need my coach as my crutch. Maybe I've got their voice in my ear asking me questions when we're not together. But I'm not relying on them to do the research for me, which I could do for myself. It's infantilizing. Service provision is infantilizing. Can you tell I'm getting on my high horse?
Well, I can tell you,
is not to infantilize. It is to bring their full adult out by us being in that adult place with them, not being in the parental role with them, which pushes them into child. So that's the difference I see between the partnership and the service and the value that we are delivering. Yes, in both instances, we are providing value, but the value of a partnership to me is far higher because it's all about the self-actualization and the empowerment and the belief in themselves.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And it's also interesting because I didn't grow up in an organizational culture, right? So for me, the service has a different meaning in a way. I totally get that. And I think that's out there. And I think it's in the way of good coaching to take place. When I think that's why I still said service, right? Because for me, being of service doesn't mean that I'm lower in the hierarchy and you can tell me what to do and you give me an order and fulfill it, right? You want the service and I provide it. I think partnership, being a partner, thinking partner is a wonderful service. And I think if we were to, for example, I did a trip to Japan with my wife for our honeymoon in March 2020, February 2020, believe it or not, just before COVID kicked off. So, but there is a serving culture, right? People serve you. But I never felt that I always felt they were at eye level, right? I always felt that there's a real human connection from human to human, and they just took so much pride in being of service, and they found so much meaning in that. So, that really struck me. And so I think asking ourselves the question of what does it mean to serve, or what does it mean to be a partner, right? I mean, there's so many partners that I've coached who really had a very different idea of what it means to be partners. It was much more that they expected their partners to deliver a service for them, as in service provision. But I think these are important questions for coaches to ask themselves.
Yeah, definitely.
You mentioned another one. You mentioned giving clients time to think. And one thing that struck me when I heard you speak about coaching is you never mentioned clients. You mentioned thinkers. You talk about thinkers and you define coaching as what was it? I have it written down here. As a joint endeavor to discover new thinking that moves the thinker forward. So there's a lot around thinking and giving time to think. But another thing that you mentioned is about interruption, right? Something we have to unlearn, something that our parents teach us is don't interrupt, because kids bounce all over the place. So I thought it was funny that you mentioned time to think, which in a Nancy Klein kind of way means never interrupt, right? Yeah. The promise to never interrupt. And just the last guest on the podcast was Linda Espy, who's teaching on time to think global faculty. So we had a really interesting conversation around why is it so important never to interrupt? And then Claire comes in and says, well, why is it so important that we do interrupt? So could you say a bit more about why that's important, and maybe in the context of time to think that I'm sure you're familiar with?
Yeah. So I have two mindset shifts in the book. One and they are kind of juxtapositions. One is silence is golden, and we need to get really comfortable with silence, because especially if we can see that they are thinking in that silence. And there is a difference between a live silence and a dead silence. A live silence is where they are thinking. They are trying to access new thoughts. So, and we can tell that because they'll be looking all over the place rather than looking directly at us. Whereas the dead silence is when they are looking at us and they are craving another question, for example.
Yeah.
But I do believe that our job is to enable them to think better. I do, I take the name thinker from Nancy Klein. That is where it originated, because they are there to think. Coachee is diminutive. Client has this service mentality attached to it. So thinker feels better. It doesn't, the only thing is that thinker only really feels like it taps into the cerebral thinking, whereas actually it's about the wisdom from the whole body. So maybe it's wisdom maker or meaning maker. Meaning maker would be a nice way to describe them. Explorer. I mean, I've come across lots of different ones, but it isn't just about the cerebral thinking. It is about enabling them to access multiple intelligences to get that new thinking that they can't get on their own. But coming back to your question about this juxtaposition between silence is golden and interrupt, like, well, hang on a minute. Which one are you saying, Claire? Well, the interruption is when we can tell that they are going over old ground. So they're telling us the story or giving us the context. It's stuff that they've already said to somebody else before. It's tripping off the tongue for them. They're looking straight at us. They're not stuttering or pausing. So we can generally tell when they're in that storytelling mode. And actually what's happening is that they are probably doing it because they think that we need to know in order to solve their problem for them.
Yeah. Sorry, can I interrupt you, please?
Go on then.
How do you tell? You say we usually can tell whether somebody is going over old material. What are some of those signs?
Well, the most obvious one is when they start the sentence to say, well, let me give you some context. So at that point, that is my signal to interrupt before they even give me context. And I will say something along the lines of, please don't feel like you need to fill me in on all the detail if you know it already. But if it would be useful to you to say it out loud, that's absolutely fine. So then they can make a conscious decision about whether to say this stuff out loud. For some people, it can be useful in the Nancy Klein kind of way, because they can start to join the dots when they start saying stuff out loud.
Yeah, I would think, I mean, in my experience, there's often a discovery of new meanings once somebody goes over old material, but with somebody who's really curious about the details.
As long as they are doing that for themselves rather than doing it for me, because a lot of the time they will be doing it for me,
right?
Because they think I need to know the whole story. Which I don't, because I'm not there to solve it for them. They're there to solve it for themselves.
Right.
So we check in about whether it is useful to them to say this out loud or not, and then they make the decision, consciously make the decision. The other time that we might notice that storytelling is, as I said, if it trips off the tongue, if they're looking directly at me, it's coming thick and fast. And then I might, at some point, I might simply say, is this useful to you to say this out loud? So that, again, they are making a conscious choice about whether it's useful to them. And they might say, well, you need to know it all. And I'm like, no.
Great contracting opportunity.
I really don't need to know it all. If you feel like you know it all already without saying it out loud, that's fabulous. We can move towards new thinking. And we can actually save time that can then be used to get to new thinking if we are brave enough to interrupt in those moments. But we have our mother's voice or our father's or our carer's voice in our head saying, it's rude to interrupt, don't do it, it's really rude. And so we stop ourselves, and then, half an hour has passed of a session, and where have we got to? not very far, because they've been telling us the same stuff as they've been telling their friend or their mother or whoever. So, you know, a really brave thing to say might be, so can I check in with you? What you're getting out of telling me this when you've paid me an awful lot of money that you can't get from telling your mum or your friend or whatever. I mean, I've never used that, but I know.
I know what I would say. I would say you're the expert in these kind of things, and I'm telling you the story so you have the context so they can ask better questions.
Well, yes, and there's that expert thing that they're believing we're the expert. We are the expert at asking questions for sure, but we don't need to know the context in order to ask really great questions. In fact, the best questions are the ones that are not driven by content. So, for example, I know of one coach who has coached in English with a translator. She's been coaching a Russian. The translator has translated from English to Russian, but has not translated back from Russian to English.
Right. So the coach would say or ask something, and then he would translate, but then not the answer. So
the coach had no clue what the answers were.
No context.
No context, nothing. But she was still able to ask questions that helped him to move forward with his thinking. And the kinds of questions she was using were what we would call process questions rather than content questions. They weren't driven by the content he shared, but it might be something like, so I'm just noticing this facial change. What just happened? So I would call that a process question. There's no content. But we're trying to get deeper underneath the surface of what does that facial expression tell the thinker about what's really going on for them.
I had a similar experience in my coach training. There was, and long story short, there was a practice session, and the client had something. We weren't quite sure who's going to coach, who's going to be the client, and the other person said, well, I've got something, but I don't want to tell you what it is. And I'm like, ooh, interesting. So in my head, all these assumptions started going. I was like, is it something illegal? Is it like drug use? Is it something super embarrassing? Is it something sexual? Like, what might it be? But we agreed to just go for it and see as an experimentation how this would work. And I think about it often because I didn't really need any of the context. Similarly, right? It's like your voice started trembling as you thought about the answer to my question. You know, because often they would think the answer to the question, but wouldn't actually say it out loud, or they would talk about the thing, and the people involved. And so very, very vague, but in the head, it was very clear. So I really didn't need to understand to make good progress. And to this day, I have no clue what it's about. And I have no clue why it was so valuable, what we've done there.
No, exactly. And that's one of the other mindset shifts in the book is at school, we're taught that we must understand everything. Whereas actually in coaching, we don't need to understand at all. I mean, how many times has somebody we've worked with used jargon or industry specific language that I don't understand? But I'm not going to stop and ask them, what does that mean every time they say it? Because that will stop their flow. The whole idea is that they get to new thinking. So quite often in times like that, I might ask questions like, so what do you know now that you didn't know at the beginning? And they'll say, and then I'll say, and so where do we need to go now? And so it's more of a recontracting question. Again, it's a process question, not a content question. We don't need to understand in order to ask great questions.
Claire, I wish I had access to your thinking when I started out as a coach, because it took years before I had the courage to set foot into an organization, because I always told myself the story that they're going to talk about some business jargon that I never understood because I hadn't had a 9-to-5 in an organization. I don't speak the language. I thought, I need to know stuff about business and organizations and what it's like to be a CEO. I don't. I really don't. And I wish somebody would have told me that. In a way, some people did tell me that, but it took some time to sink in. It took me to step up and have a conversation and go into a meeting room and have some people there who spoke business and realized that I don't need to understand. They're just people. You know, the process matters.
Yeah, exactly right. And yeah, I mean, I think some people would argue that, you know, on if we posted that on LinkedIn, some people would say, oh, but you really do need to understand, you know, have been in that context. Well, possibly when an organization is recruiting for their coaching pool, that might be something that they look for. But we know as coaches that it's not necessary.
But that's a bit of a
because
dilemma.
We're not mentors. We are not there to mentor them. So we don't need to understand the nitty gritty.
Is this still alive? I mean, you just kind of implied it, but like I remember years ago, I came across a statistic that the number one decision-making factor for organizations to hire coaches is industry experience. I mean, not in the industry of coaching, but in the industry that they're coaching in. Is that still a thing?
I don't know. I think for mature organizations who understand coaching, I think it's moved towards the top thing being a credential. I mean, I don't know that for sure, but I suspect that would have moved much higher towards the top of the vetting process. In fact, I would say that's kind of a low bar. In a way, that's the least that we need to have would be credential, because the organization can tell that we've jumped through some hoops and gone through a lot of learning in order to professionalize ourselves and be awarded the credential by a neutral body who doesn't have the same vested interest as a training company has in giving us a certificate. Of course, they want to pass us. They want to be able to say that we've had, you know, X amount of people through our classes. Whereas the ICF or EMCC or AC or any other coaching body for that matter, they're neutral. They don't have a vested interest in, well, they do.
I was about to challenge you on that.
Of course, they want more people to be credentialed, but I think certainly with the ICF, I know the ICF credentialing process inside out, back to front, and I would say that the way that they ask us to submit recordings to show how we actually coach, that is just so powerful. I mean, taking away the fact that people have performance anxiety when they're recording themselves, and there are ways and means of getting over that, but and so they may not be quite themselves in that recording, but it's so important for us to measure how a person is actually showing up in the coaching room, not what they say about their coaching. Because the number of times I've spoken to coaches when I, you know, might be I don't know, looking for somebody to do a video or something. This is when I was internal, and they've talked a good story, but then when I actually saw them coaching, I was like, oh no, you're not living up to that belief at all. So for example, the big thing, the clearest of all mindsets, I think, that we talk about in coaching is that we believe that our thinker is creative, resourceful, and whole. And we can say that, yes, I believe that all my thinkers are creative, resourceful, and whole. But when I watch coaches in action,
they go and rescue
that they are not putting that into action. So they must actually have a very different mindset or belief underpinning the way that they are showing up. Because perhaps they're asking a leading question that might be aimed at getting the thinker to the answer that the coach thinks they should be getting to, when in fact there are multiple answers to a question. I mean, if it was as easy as that, then they would have figured it out on their own, or they would have gone on the internet to resolve it. They need to be able to access solutions that work for them, given their personality, their context, the people around their stakeholders. And so us asking a leading question, that is not tapping into that creativity, resourcefulness and wholeness.
Yeah. But the story is there through training. So, it's easy to tell it to us so much that we believe it, but then we often don't really notice how it's coming out as a different story that we clearly still holding.
Yes, exactly. And that's why I think it's so crucial that we do go back to our mindsets as coaches, just as we would, when we're coaching, that's the transformational stuff, is to work with people around mindset, beliefs, limiting beliefs, etc., values. And so we need to do that for ourselves and figure out which are the mindsets that are getting in my way of being the most masterful coach that I can be. And that is absolutely one of them.
Claire, I want to talk to you about transformation. Before we go there, just because you've mentioned it a moment ago, I've seen a lot of coaches treat the ICF credentialing, or any other credentialing for that matter, a bit like a driving test, right? That we know what we need to do in order to pass the test. And then a couple of years down the line, everybody's going to do their own driving. And they're going to develop their own style. And some of that might be a creative interpretation of the rule that we once learned. And sometimes we just make our own rules. And so I see coaches being like, well, yeah, I know technically I should do that, but I just don't agree that in every context, that's the best way to do. So there's a lot of people who are credentialed by the ICF, for example. But then, once they have it, they kind of do very different coaching. And I don't think a recredentialing requires another video. So do you see that as a concern?
Yes, I do, because I don't think it's ethical to badge oneself as an ACC or a PCC or an MCC and then say, oh, that's it now, I'm just going to do it my own way. It's just not ethical. You can't claim to be aligned with a coaching body if you don't coach in that way. That may be sound a bit harsh, but that's kind of what I think is. But then I suppose it depends what people are getting the credential for. Do they actually believe that this form of coaching is the most transformational form of coaching, to be non-directive, to believe that the person in front of them is creative, resourceful and whole, and all of these other things that go with the credential? Or do they not? So if they don't believe in that stuff, then why align with it? And potentially it's because it gets them work.
It opens doors, right? Because it creates that trust that, oh, this person has jumped through the hoops, and we trust the ICF, and by extension, this coach has fulfilled a certain foundation of being a good coach. But it's difficult to police that in any way. I know the ICF changed their ethical guidelines a couple of years ago, that as a member of the ICF, if you see an ICF member not adhere to ICF guidelines, that you should have a conversation. And if that conversation isn't fruitful, technically you should report them to the ICF. I never heard of anybody doing that.
No, it's really hard. I know somebody's brought that to supervision before and said, I don't know what to do. I know that Code of Ethics says I should report them, but they're really senior, and so yeah, it's a tricky one. I get it. I understand that. And yeah, it's like being a grass, isn't it? But
being a grass.
A grass, yeah. So we would say that if somebody grasses to the police about a criminal that they've seen.
Right. Snitches get stitches.
Snitch, yeah. It's tricky. It's really tricky. How do you ensure that people have really signed up to this way of coaching and don't slip back? And often I'll see people coming let's say they got credentialed as an ACC some time back and they're coming back for PCC, or maybe they're going straight into PCC and think that they're coaching well, and then actually when it comes down to it, they recognize, well, they don't want to recognize, but in the feedback that they get from the mentor coaching, they realize that they've got into bad habits, and actually those habits are quite hard to break, and the more we do them, the harder it becomes to break them. So as you said, Janek, it's much better if a person can break those habits before they've even developed them in the first place. Because there's so much of that stuff that has happened in life and work that we need to let go of to be a really great, masterful coach. But people need to believe that.
And that's the paradigm shift that is transformation, right? As we see it as a school at Anima. So there's a paradigm shift, something significant shifts in the way that you view things. And I love that you put out so many practical examples of what these paradigms are and how they play out. So maybe you could give us a couple of others, kind of beliefs that you've noticed. Possibly a recent one that isn't in the book.
So there's one that I kind of get to, but don't quite. I would say it differently now, and that is to lean into emotion. There seems to be a mindset in some coaches that they are actually scared of emotion. They are scared that emotion, if they allow the emotion out
but then it becomes therapy, and it's scary.
It becomes that therapy, and they can't cope with it, and they feel like they're not trained to do that. So there's a belief that I can't go there if there's any emotion. I must contain it back into the box, and we must move on. Whereas actually, if that emotion is emotion in the present rather than triggered by something in the past, if it's we're all emotional.
Emotions are always there. It's like the ecosystem. It's always around, we pay attention to it or not.
Yeah, and they're not there because of some trauma in the past. For, I don't know, what would I say, the majority of people? I don't know. But most of the people we work with, they can get emotional in a coaching session, and that does not make it therapy. And therefore, there's this thing about what I notice is that coaches step away from the cliff. They take 3 or 4 steps further away from asking about the emotion that's present in the room, because they're scared to go there, when actually it would be better to move closer to the cliff, because we will know when we have become out of our depth. And it's at that point, if we then discover actually this emotion is triggered by some trauma in the past, that's when we need to have the courage to triage and point them in the direction of a therapist. But yeah, coaches don't seem to lean into that enough. And yet that's where the work really happens, is if we start to look at what is that emotion telling you about this thing, what's underneath the surface here, what if those tears could talk, what would they say? If what's going on in those tight shoulders that I'm seeing, that's not emotion, that's feeling, but that's accessing the body. So there's something about having courage to work with emotion, and not to think that immediately means it must be therapy and I'm not qualified.
Yeah, that image of standing by a cliff or moving closer to the cliff is still vivid in my mind, because that can feel quite scary for a coach, I mean, for a person, right? Peter Hawkins talks about getting to the learning edge, not knowing, the coach doesn't know, the client doesn't know. We just both know we need to find an answer here.
Yes.
But I totally get why some coaches wouldn't want to get closer to the cliff, because what if the client falls? You know, I feel responsible if I let them closer to the cliff and say, "Ooh, what's that? Shall we have a look?" You know, or, you know, at least be complicit in some way by walking there together.
But what I'm not saying is going right up to the cliff edge. I'm saying getting closer to the cliff edge than we are at the moment.
Yeah.
So, you know, we're still 2 or 3 paces away from the cliff edge. We're still safe. And we're not going to topple over. And that space also then, if the trauma from the past does come up, then we know that, okay, let's have a conversation about perhaps coaching isn't the right intervention right now, or for this particular thing that we're working on. And to encourage them to seek support somewhere else. And there's something even about having that conversation that coaches shy away from. I can't say that. That's rude. Maybe there's something there about no, that you know, that's going to undermine their confidence if I say they need therapy. Well, we're not saying they need it, but we're noticing and we're having a conversation with them about whether actually it would be useful to them to unpack this trauma from the past. And when I talk about trauma, I don't necessarily mean big T trauma. It could be little t trauma.
We don't even need to use the terminology in my experience. I mean, I don't want to diagnose somebody as being traumatized or having experienced any sort of trauma, because as a coach, it's not really my place to say. What I can say is there's this big thing that keeps coming in the way, or, you know, we don't seem to be able to make progress unless we figure this thing out. And for me, it doesn't feel right to go into it. It might be better placed with somebody who has more experience with the big stuff like that.
Yeah, there we go. See, that's how to say it.
Thank you. No, but there's so many different ways to say it, right? It just comes out of my mouth as clearly because I thought about it a lot and I tried many different versions. It did not sound like that the first time I made the suggestion. It sounded very wobbly.
Yeah, and I remember way back when the first time I needed to have that conversation, and it hasn't happened that often, but I think it's happening more often recently than it did when I was first coaching. So we need to get used to it, and we need to get comfortable with it, and we need to, whether that's practicing in front of the mirror or writing what we think we might say, so that when we go into that first time of needing to say it, we know how to say it in a way that, and you know, honestly, it doesn't matter if it's clunky. The fact is, we are human to human, and it'll be fine.
Yeah, and if we do believe that our clients are resourced, you know, then we can trust them to make the right decision.
Yes.
You know, we don't have to carry all of the responsibility.
No, exactly right.
Yeah. Claire, we could talk for hours about many of these paradigm shifts. I've seen a section in, I think you delivered a talk at the ICF conference in 2021. If you Google YouTube your name and ICF 2021, you'll find it. You did this exercise about, hey, stand up or keep your hand up. And then do you hesitate to interrupt? Do you often ask, tell me more about that? Do you sometimes want to rescue? Do you find it awkward to bring in drawing or working with a buddy? Do you sometimes go over time? Do you sometimes want to add value through recommendations or making suggestions? You know, I found myself there, I sometimes want to do that. I know. So I recommend people, if they find themselves that, do get a mentor coach, do get a supervisor. There's so much to explore.
Yeah, and those are all the things that I mean, everything that's in the book is all stuff that I have seen coaches, or it shows up in their behavior, but then when we talk about it, we recognize that it's underpinned by a limiting belief of some kind. So it's the belief that we need to work on.
And a story that built a paradigm that is still alive, right?
Exactly.
So what a wonderful journey. Hey, I have while I'm talking to a master mentor coach, I wanted to ask you something that I hear a lot. In the context of ICF guidelines and competencies, is that thing about judgments. I hear so many coaches, including myself, say like, oh, that's great, or fantastic, or that's lovely, or I love that you're saying that, right? All of these are technically judgments, and I hear them all the time. Could you say a bit more about, do we need to cut all of that out? Why is that important? Just because it seems so entrenched. And most people don't really think much about it. It's like, yeah, I think that's great. Great idea.
Yeah. And of course, the trouble with that is that they will then come back and say, well, you told me to do it. I mean, you didn't tell them to do it, but you
judged it as valuable.
Yeah, exactly. So that was an encouragement for them to try it out, which, yes, some of the people we work with need some extra encouragement. But actually, there's a difference between a judgment like that. Oh, that's interesting. Oh, that's great. Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's brilliant. But all of those kinds of things, which don't really add any value, in fact, probably do detract from the value because they need to be believing themselves. Moving from that to more of an acknowledgement. So acknowledging who they are being in coming to this solution, or acknowledging that they have shown that they are capable from things that they've done in the past, for example. So somebody I was coaching a while back, she was doing a lot of self-coaching, and yet she was saying, oh, I really need to make sure I have more coaching so that I can process this stuff. And the acknowledgement from me was to do with, well, I noticed how much you were self-coaching during that session. And I wonder whether you might want to ponder on how much you were self-coaching, and therefore your capacity to do that without a coach as well as with a coach.
Powerful.
So yeah, more of an acknowledgement of who she was being in that session, which she was blind to. She just didn't see it. And so I could acknowledge something that I had seen in her that might be useful to her. Rather than these just judgments.
Yeah, and it's so helpful to see it play out. I heard you say that in mentor coaching there isn't a place to hide, because in supervision you would usually talk about your clients, and in mentor coaching, as far as I understand, you always bring a recording to the mentor coach and you would review it and then look at it in the context of the competencies. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. So we would stop and start it, and we would look at how well did you set up the session contract in the first place. So that would be competency 3 around the coaching agreement. So we would have a discussion about how you could build on that, strengthen it, get even more focus into the coaching. And then we would carry on and we would listen to a bit more, and then we'd stop it again, and I'd be asking them, so what do you notice from the outside rather than from the inside, and or what was going on for you in that moment that caused you to ask that question. So yeah, you can't, it's the spotlight shone right on your coaching, which when people come to mentor coaching for the first time, they do find that quite hard, understandably. And if they can approach it with a growth mindset rather than a fixed mindset of, I want to lap up as much of this feedback as I can get, and I want to make these tweaks, these fine tuning to my coaching based on shifting some of my mindsets. If we shift the mindset first, then we'll be able to shift the skill set. If we don't shift the mindset, then we'll go back to the old habits based on the old mindset after we've got the credential, as we were talking about before. So it's really important that we work at the mindset level in mentor coaching,
Mm.
in order for the skill sets, the competencies then to flow more naturally.
That they follow the mindset, right? If you do the transformative work and the mindset shifts, then the behavior will changes. If you just do things differently, you don't, sometimes you become different by doing things differently, but usually it's the other way around, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. It's certainly, I've noticed it's more sustainable if we can change the mindset first.
Yeah. What would you respond to someone who might say, well, it all sounds a bit authoritative, and do I always have to have a clearly achievable SMART goal, something that is like measurable? Do I always need to have an action plan and design some steps that this client needs to take, who they're going to be accountable for? Because that's certainly how I rubbed up against the ICF framework. So I get where that is. So some of this is mine. And sometimes in contexts, I think it's my experience is I have a sense that it's probably better if you just take this home and ponder and we meet again, rather than trying to make this into an action framework. But I know the ICF is very clear and in their credentialing quite rigid about it. So I wonder what you respond to someone like me, or maybe representing some other people who rub up against the framework in this way.
Well, in the new set of competencies, they have updated that a bit. So, for example, if you look at the PCC marker 8.5, it says the coach partners with the client to design post-session thinking, reflection, or action. So it doesn't have to be action. It could be thinking or reflection.
But there is a commitment to what's going to happen moving forward. It doesn't have to be an action. But like, how are you going to move forward with this?
Yes, exactly. And the purpose of that is to make sure that they know what it is that they want to do more with, not necessarily do more with, think more about, or research more, or whatever it is that they want to do next. It just gives them that extra oomph to keep going in between sessions, rather than expecting all the work to happen in the session, because it doesn't all happen in
No.
There's so much of it happens afterwards, and much of that might be not conscious change but subconscious. But if we can, it's like if you ask yourself a question before you go to sleep, your brain will work on that question, and then you'll wake up and you'll have an answer, hopefully, or something will have changed in overnight as you ponder a question like that. And that's exactly what happens at the end of coaching. If they have a question that they're taking away, or a reflection, or just something they want to think more about, it doesn't, as I say, it doesn't have to be a doing thing, because that's transactional. Doing is transactional. We want to create the transformational stuff.
Yeah, and just that's just slipped out of you, right? What's the question you're taking away? I just love that. It's such a simple question. It doesn't have to be an action plan. Sometimes the question you take away is much more valuable, because, as you say, I would probably argue most of what's the progress that's happening is happening between sessions, or even after the coaching.
Yes. Yeah. So back to answering your question about the rigidity of it. One of the things I say is, yes, we've got this set of markers, PCC markers, against which we are assessed, but every single one of us displays those markers differently. We can bring our own style into those markers. And as long as we have the arc of a coaching session with a really good framing at the beginning and a good wrap up at the end, just magic can happen. If we don't have a good start, a good beginning to a coaching session, then actually we will meander and we won't use the time productively. Shall I say productively? When I say productively, I don't mean getting to solutions. I mean going deep. I mean, exploring the territory, all of that kind of thing.
People who can't listen to people are listening just can't see me smile, because I love how you say something and then kind of dig into what that is and what that actually means and how it might come across.
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah, exactly. Just to make sure that I'm saying what I really mean here. So,
good luck.
yeah. So having a good beginning, having a good ending is absolutely vital to create this thinking space. I circle back to where we started. That is what's going to create the thinking space, a place that is safe for them to do the work that they need to do.
Yeah. Oh, wonderful. That feels like a really good circle. And thank you so much for making the time. Is there something you would want to let people know? I mean, there's a lot of coaches, new coaches, experienced coaches. Is there a message that you want to bring across? Is there some way that you want to use this platform to do something good for yourself or the world or the coaching industry?
Thank you. Yeah, so if I go back to this idea of unlearning mindsets that are getting in your way of masterful coaching. So keep coming back to that unlearning. And if you want some prompts on the kinds of things you might wish to unlearn, then you can buy my book, The Transformational Coach, Free Your Thinking and Unlock Your Coaching Mastery. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it on my website. And I'm very happy if people link in with me as well, because I'm always posting useful stuff on social media for coaches.
You certainly do. What's your website?
Clare Norman Coaching Associates.com.
Fantastic. Clare, thank you so much for your work. Keep doing the work. You make better coaches make the world better. So I appreciate what you do, and speak soon.
Thank you. Lovely to be with you.